Okay, so we are officially recording. So without further ado, I'm going to thank Dr. Russell Tytler for joining us and giving us this webinar today. He's going to be talking to us about productive tensions between disciplinary and transdisciplinary reasoning and practice. So really thinking about STEM education across boundaries from an international perspective as well. So looking forward to learning from him. And so, Dr. Tytler, it's over to you. I'm going to mute myself and let you take it away.
Okay, thanks, Jill. Can you hear me okay? Yeah,
Yes,
that's fine.
coming through
Okay,
fine.
and thanks very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts with people and have a conversation. I'm Russell Tytler. I'm a professor of science education at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. And yeah, what I'm going to talk about is really this issue of disciplines and STEM and the way they might interrelate productively and some of the challenges associated with that. And I'll try to bring in as much as I can an international perspective. Well, I suppose from being from Australia, it's a little bit international anyway. But let's see how we go. I'd like to begin, as we have become accustomed to doing in Australia, by acknowledging the various lands on which we gather. And today we speak, well, certainly in Australia, from many lands of the Kulin Nations. I'm on Wurundjeri land myself, and we pay our respects to elders and ancestors, past and present, and acknowledge that they never ceded sovereignty. So what I'm going to talk about is, first of all, some of the work we've done on looking at STEM internationally, and relate that to the growing move to redefine or rethink science education in terms of the uncertain futures that we associate with the Anthropocene, and ask, well, what does that mean for how we proceed in the STEM disciplines in education? And I'll give then, we'll move to a couple of case studies to illustrate some of the work we've been doing to unpack the nature of STEM and what is driving it, and what are some of the outcomes for students, and finally some of the challenges and opportunity. So that's the agenda, and we'll see how we go. So, as promised, an international perspective first. This comes from a few years ago, almost a decade now, actually, 2014. We were commissioned by Australia's chief scientist at the time to run a STEM country comparisons study, where we looked at 20 plus countries, each of which we were in contact with a local expert to really unpack the nature of STEM, what was happening with STEM policy and practice in the country in terms of science, R&D, and the impact on schools. Out of that also came a book that you've got there. What we found was, well, obviously, the importance of STEM in terms of government policies was very much a focus right across the board. And part of the driver, or a large part of the driver for that, was this link that was had been clearly identified between science research and development, educational attainment as measured, for instance, by the PISA or TIMSS international tests, and economic dynamism. In other words, a healthy and well attended, if you like, STEM education was good for national wealth creation. And I think in that there are three levels at which we can talk about this. There's the demand for STEM professionals to drive, for instance, engineering and science R&D projects. There's the need or growing recognition of the need for STEM skills across the workforce. And then there's also an argument for the importance of having a STEM literate population. And so various of those were emphasized in different of the countries. In Australia itself, the concern was driven by declining participation in STEM pathways. And I think that's perhaps still the case in the States. We had a declining science and maths performance measured internationally, and also there was a concern that schools weren't properly preparing students to engage with the STEM workforce of the future. And you can see the quote there from Australia's Chief Scientist Ian Chubb at the time, really arguing for STEM as being really important, even though it may not be a huge fraction, or the jobs may not be a huge fraction of the total jobs. It's a huge fraction of sustained economic growth. Some of the differences we found, we characterized by dividing the global STEM into 4 areas. High-performing Anglosphere countries, which were really concerned in their STEM policy with addressing unmet labour market demand for STEM skills. And so very much a wealth creation, and often talk of a STEM crisis. In Western Europe, however, there was more of a concern about public perceptions and knowledge of science, and community involvement and school involvement in STEM. East and Southeast Asian countries, for instance, Hong Kong, Singapore, Korea, for instance, they typically had long-term science and technology policies that had been in place for some time and were associated with their growing industrialization and strength in both education and in economic terms. And finally, emerging economies were focused on quality education and emerging industry development. And so there was a difference in the way that STEM was characterized, or the STEM policy. There were differences across those different countries, also in the way they'd characterize STEM education. I'll just point out a couple here that there was differential emphasis on standardized testing versus local flexibility, and emphasis on inquiry and innovation. There was different balance between focusing on a specialized elite and STEM for all, and that often included Indigenous populations. And lastly, there was an emerging interest at the time in interdisciplinary STEM, or STEAM, including the arts. So that's what we found at the time. And I think those parameters, if you like, are still in place pretty well. I want to move now to talking about part of the drivers for STEM is the fact that we've got an increasingly rapidly changing world globally, through a number of different dimensions, if you like. First of all is digital disruption and the impact of that on the workforce. You've got AI, you've got big data, you've got automation and so on, and that's changing hugely the workplace and the future of work for young people in our schools. There's all of the geographic and demographic changes that are occurring due to globalization, increasing urbanization, changes in demographics. I know certainly in Australia we've got an aging population. And then there's the threats of the Anthropocene, climate change, sustainability threats, biodiversity loss, and radically altered energy futures, which is driving a lot of science R&D and has become an important sort of public awareness issue, certainly in Australia. And then there was the pandemic. And growing out of this, I mean, this goes some way back into the 90s. People started talking about generic skills or wider skill sets or competencies that prepare people for different work futures. This one was CSIRO, which is the National Science and Technology organization in Australia, did this Futures of Work report, and really talked about the importance of education and training, new capabilities needed, digital literacy increasingly important, and the changing importance of STEM. part of the points that were made in that and or in other documents was that really youth of today don't have the stable career futures that would have been the case a couple of decades ago. And so there's that puts increasing emphasis on broader skills rather than thinking of training for specific jobs. And the point being made there that the education system as it's currently structured is preparing students for work realities of the past rather than the future. So we've got a lot of different pressures there in the mix. This is an example in Australia of this emphasis on STEM skills. There was a survey done of industries about what attributes they regard as important for appointing people to their workplace. And we've got active learning, critical thinking, complex problem solving, creative problem solving, interpersonal skills. You recognise all of those. They're often either called or part of 21st century skills or STEM skills. Mind you, I think there's a little bit of a sliding argument going on here in that I think if you're appointing, let's say, an engineer, you want all of those things, but you also want engineering knowledge and you want someone with an engineering degree. So I think some of this argument for generic skills is a little bit misplaced in its emphasis. I was just going to talk briefly about this project I'm involved in. I'm a representative of the OECD in a Israeli-led forum on STEM skills. And what we're doing over a period of time we've been doing is trying to unpack these different skills, what they might mean, how we define them, how you would measure them. And this table, I think, gives us a nice picture of, well, not only the skills, and you can argue with the particular skills that are mentioned there, but the fact that they imply knowledge, what knowledge is associated in different disciplines with each of them, and skills, what are the values and attitudes, what pedagogies might we put in place, how might we plan to promote them, and how might we evaluate them if we're moving beyond evaluating for knowledge and application of knowledge as we traditionally conceive of it, how might you evaluate those? So there are a lot of questions in all of this, I think, for us in the education system. And this is a project we were involved with a few years ago, commissioned by Ford Australia, on 100 Jobs of the Future, where we interviewed some leaders internationally in important disciplines that were growth disciplines and asked them about the future in their particular discipline or industry and what it meant for future work. And we created out of the 100 jobs of the future that don't yet exist and looked at the skills that they were talking about. And that quote there, learn how to code and learn how to paint, was characteristic of a lot of those jobs, that they required creativity, but they required disciplinary knowledge, but they required a wider skill set around those. And so people need to be both specialist and generalist, and they need to be flexible and creative. That was the message strongly coming out of that. So out of all of that, and this is a slide I stole from Jonathan Osborne, who gave a talk at Deakin a couple of weeks ago, looking at really an analysis of the skills needed for future work. This work was done back around 2000, I think, and just looking at the decreasing call for routine manual work, routine cognitive work, and even non-routine manual work, and the increasing premium on expert thinking and complex communicating. And so that has huge implications, I think, for our schooling system. And I know in Australia, and you'd have it elsewhere, a lot of the jobs that youth would would traditionally go into, like being in factories where you've got automated, or where you've now got automated processes. Those jobs don't exist anymore. So what futures do they have? They need to be prepared for different futures, which was part of Ford's concern when they contracted us to do that work. And correspondingly, if you look at the way we frame our education in the disciplines, this is the maths discipline. This is an analysis of textbooks in mathematics and how they've changed in the problem-solving strategies, number of problem-solving strategies that are promoted, and also the level of conceptual abstraction. And you'll see over the 20th century, those have both risen. And so education is changing. And I think if we're going to talk about STEM, I think it really sits within these broader movements of changes to the way we conceptualize what it is to know and be competent in disciplines, what work futures students are facing, and what large challenges, problems, situations we're facing at a global level. So maybe, Jill, I might pause there just for a moment if people have any questions or comments at this stage before I go on to some of the pressures for science.
Yeah, I can share a couple of questions that have cropped up in the chat, and if others have questions, feel free to jump in. Janelle asked if you could clarify your definition of STEM.
Okay.
And
yes.
Dr. Chiani followed up and asked if you could, in addition to the definition of STEM, elaborate on how we could differentiate between STEM knowledge and skills and STEM competences.
Okay, two good questions.
Yeah.
I think, look, certainly it's interesting in Australia. I think in the talking about STEM, and STEM was really came into public discourse largely through the chief scientist, Ian Chubb, at the time. And I think he started off talking about STEM as this sort of broad category of disciplines, science, technology, engineering, maths, not thinking of them as being integrated. And so I think there is a slide in meaning if that's what you were really questioning. And a lot of, when we went for that STEM country comparisons, we really didn't specify interdisciplinary or integrated STEM, but that broad area of subjects, which are sort of, as the original acronym referred to, that they kind of refer to this broad grouping of competencies or skills or subjects, disciplines. So both interdisciplinary STEM and STEM as a collection of subjects. And I think in terms of, sorry, the second question was?
If I unmute, I'm trying to differentiate between, if you could help differentiate between STEM knowledge, STEM skills, and STEM competences.
Yeah. I mean, this is the interesting thing. I think STEM skills is a misnomer, actually. I mean, skills is kind of a word that is often associated with manual skills, but it's come to also mean higher level skills, critical thinking, and so on. But I think I like to think of it more in terms of a competence, because it requires knowledge and skills. So to me, I think of competence as a combination of knowledge, skills, and attitudes, really, dispositions, so that if you're competent in something, you won't, even if you have knowledge and skills, but you're really not interested, or you're really not of a mind to really apply those to problems, then it's not a competence that emerges. So that would be my thinking about that. I don't know that there's general agreement on these things, but
that's probably why the questions came up, right? I think we all have a slightly different way we frame things. So
I think we should clarify. Exactly.
Yeah. So someone else just dropped in the chat. Thank you, Deodat. So should we be looking at STEM as an integrated discipline?
Right. What a good question for me to go on with my talk, because that's exactly what I'm going to be dealing with. Okay, so let me start with the disciplines themselves, and particularly science. I'm a member of the science expert group for PISA. I was for PISA 2018 and again 2025, and we've just had a meeting recently in Melbourne looking at that, which is why Jonathan Osborne, who chairs it, was around in Melbourne. Prior to that, in the lead up, Oxford University Press, which had the contract for developing the framework, ran this global survey of science teachers about their perception of the future of science education. Now, I found it interesting, and I've selected from this, but you can look at the whole thing with that link. To the question, the science curriculum currently taught in schools enables young people to become scientifically literate and active citizens. 66% of those teachers either agreed or strongly agreed with that proposition. So that's encouraging. Not so encouraging for the other 34%, I suppose, but the other next question, current science education is fit for the future, only 31% either agreed or strongly agreed with that. So there is an issue recognised by science teachers globally that we need to change. I mean, some years ago, I wrote a monograph which had a fair bit of airtime, certainly in Australia, coming out of a big national conference, arguing for a reimagining of science education. And I think a lot of the arguments that were put at that conference are still valid. And in terms of the challenges, climate change and environmental challenges are by far the biggest that were seen by these teachers, followed by fake news and being able to filter information, technological advancement, pace of change, and global pandemic. And so these are huge global issues that are driving, I think, or putting pressure on how we might conceptualize a science education. This is, in fact, the PISA framework in a diagram for 2025, which is centered around this notion of competencies. And feeding into competencies, as I said, there's knowledge, there's certain contexts, different contexts in which you can express competencies, and what used to be science attitudes is now being changed to science identity, including environmental awareness, concern, and agency. And so if you look at those three competencies, the first one is your traditional competency explaining phenomena. Secondly is your science inquiry, really your scientific practices in NGSS terms, I guess, designing for inquiry and interpreting data. And the third one is new, research, evaluate and use scientific information for decision making and action. And that's really about that issue of being able to discern what is reliable scientific data when you're making decisions, and how you make judgments about the validity of what you're being told. Really underpinning, or not underpinning, but so importantly in the mix in this round of PISA is this document, Agency in the Anthropocene, which arose from the OECD's really major concern to make sure that science reflected the pressures from climate change and environmental sustainability issues. And that feeds both into the identity issues about how we respond to climate change and biodiversity loss and all of those things, but also it is used to feed into the context in which we're asking young people to think about their science and interpret science. So I'll get now, so that's kind of some of the background. The question of the disciplines and interdisciplinary STEM is the question that was asked before, which I'm now coming to. I think the advocacy for interdisciplinary STEM, and I find certainly in Australia, it's become much more of a thing. People are really trying to develop school processes where the different STEM subjects are integrated, combined, linked in some way. They're the arguments as I see them, that it reflects how knowledge is built and applied in the real world. There is evidence of learning gains from complementary disciplinary approaches. And we ourselves have a project linking mathematics and science in the primary school, for instance, and we get a lot of benefits for both subjects by strategically feeding off the other. So that's that would certainly be convincing to me. Evidence of engagement of students with real life contextual projects, focus on 21st century skills, a concern that engineering has been a silence in the school curriculum, and so STEM becomes a way of bringing in design as an important part of that. And again, that's part of the NGSS there. And also a lot of argument about the need to break down strangleholds of disciplines and teacher-centered pedagogies that traditionally characterize them. So there's a pedagogical argument in here too. Some of the challenges, though, if you think about how those disciplines are put together, a good friend of mine, David Clark, who unfortunately died a few years ago now, talked about STEM possibly being the name for a fairly monumental category error, and pointed out that each of those disciplines have different epistemologies, epistemic practices, have different tools that they use, different forms of reasoning, and so on. And so there is an issue about thinking about jamming them together, if you think of that as an undifferentiated process. There's concerns about disciplinary integrity and depth by having this run of STEM projects. That's Richard Lira, who was speaking at a STEM seminar that we ran a few years ago. Concern that not all aspects of disciplinary fields can be covered by applied-based project learning. And lastly, the political issue of how you establish integrated studies in the face of entrenched disciplinary interests. And Peter Fensham made the point strongly that every time we've tried that in Australia, the disciplines have won out. We've been here before with integrated studies. So let's have a look at what this might look like. This is a study, or part of a study we did a couple of years back, where we looked at some of a fairly major STEM program we had run out of Deakin, with schools organising STEM in very different ways. This particular example is of some maths teachers who were also science teachers who integrated maths into their science classes. I'm sorry, the other way around. They integrated science into their maths classes. And this particular activity was to design a wheelchair ramp for a specific location in the school. And students investigate disabled ramps in the broader community, looked at slope and design and what the needs were. They measured and produced scale maps, drawings of maps for their own school location. They investigated ramps using dynamic trolleys to test practicality, and they designed the ramp to scale. Quotes from teachers we interviewed here. One girl came up to me and asked if she knew the angle and the length. Is there a formula to work out the height? And so the teacher's arguing that that student is learning. There was evidence of deeper learning about trigonometry in this case, because the problem kind of led to the need for some of those trigonometric formulae. Another teacher reported that as those practices became more entrenched, the maths teachers there saw their subject in a new light and not so routine and abstract. And what the outcomes for students included not only science and maths knowledge, but engagement with the social dimensions of STEM, empathy, for instance, in this case, thinking about the uses of science and technology for those people with special needs, and engagement with science and engagement with thinking and working mathematically. So arguing from this that if you think about the link between science, engineering and tech and mathematics there, it's not as if they were jammed together in an undifferentiated way. Rather, the strength is the way they interrelate in the kind of links between them. And so you've got the science and engineering design was in the context of social needs and aesthetic and economic constraints as well. And so you're seeing this, the disciplines in a more authentic, if you like, situation. And for mathematics, the link was in learning to mathematize the natural world rather than just looking at set up problems. It was the power of being able to see maths being created by that interrelation between the subjects. And so I would say that rather than there being a meta-knowledge, it's if there is a meta-knowledge, it's really about how those subjects intertwine in natural ways and mutually supporting ways, and in wider contexts that might feature other knowledge. And so along with that, we analysed what was actually happening in some of those projects, and thinking about that spatial metaphor I showed you before with the circles intersecting, we propose that also we need to think of the interrelation between the disciplines temporally, in other words, at different timescales. So you've got the macro timescale, which is really about, for science, in a STEM designed curriculum, the longer term goals and the need to have a progression in sophistication of knowledge in different topics over the time. There's the meso level timescale with how do you actually do this over a number of lessons? How do you design the maths and the science and the technology to interrelate there? And at the micro level, in the actual problem, cut and thrust of the problem itself, how do you have set up problems such that the science and the maths and the technology actually interweave in natural ways and supporting ways? And so I guess out of those studies, which we did maybe up to 3 or 4 years ago, I'd argue that the temporal dimensions are important when we think about integrating subjects at those different levels. There will be challenges at each level of temporality, you know, how you plan for a coherent curriculum progression, and challenge of how you actually design learning sequences that integrate in natural ways, and how you have an authentic task where the students naturally integrates the disciplines. I think the implications of this for rethinking the epistemic practices, and so we saw, for instance, with the wheelchair, that you had the maths that had the maths teachers had to rethink in a way the way that the maths knowledge was constructed and students engaged with mathematical thinking and learning. And so, as I argued before, the value out of STEM is about their situating in wider contexts and in their interrelations, would be my argument. I'm going to next look at some more recent case studies that we did. Perhaps I might pause here, Jill, perhaps for a couple more questions. It'll push me over the 3/4 hour, but
yeah, no. Janelle had a comment in the chat. I can read the comment, and Janelle, if you feel free to unmute and clarify or follow up. Janelle had said, I think it's important to consider the level at which we're reflecting on desired outcomes. If we're talking about high-level specialized research versus broader and integrated exposure and engagement for young learners, traditional siloed STEM fields are notorious for weeding out most learners.
That's a good point. In fact, I'll show you when I look at this case study, what's driving integrated STEM is this realization that a lot of kids are dropping off the perch, not interested with traditional ways of looking at the subjects. And so, and at the other end, I guess the question is, how can you have, this is the macro level temporal question, how can you have a coherent progression in high level and sophisticated disciplinary knowledge? How do you support that within a STEM environment? So I think at both levels, there are interesting benefits and challenges.
Kira asks, what are the challenges in terms of teacher knowledge to implement STEM projects?
Yeah, well, I think, again, maybe the case study I'm about to move into will deal with that. I mean, I don't have a good answer. Actually, I have a PhD student currently looking at the teacher identity entailments of integrated STEM. But I think a lot of it comes down to how closely teachers work together and are open about their particular specializations. And again, as I'll point out or maybe it's not, it is apparent in one of the case studies I'll talk about, that the maths teachers in this particular school had difficulty thinking about how to draw maths productively out of some of these projects. But in the case I'm thinking of, they had a very experienced maths teacher who was quite innovative, who actually helped them do that. And so it was a learning process, in a way, relearning how to use your knowledge productively to deal with authentic problems. Because I think a lot of science and maths teachers have learnt their craft in a fairly constrained environment. And so I think throwing that back into a more open environment of STEM, I think does create potential challenges.
Got one more question here, Russell, before we move on. Oh, and I've just lost that. There we go. Where did it go? I lost it. Someone was asked.
You've
got it. Okay.
Students are not experts in particular STEM discipline. Yeah, this is Shalami. So it is a real experience of integration for the students. Are they aware of the particular integration, or is the integration only at the level of the curriculum designer? Yeah, that's also a very good question. And you'll see in these case studies, the schools were very explicit about where the maths, where the science, where the technology was. They built into their STEM projects assessments, or into their project assessment criteria that specifically addressed disciplinary knowledge. So yes, I think in the model, certainly I'm going to talk about that was a concern, and it was well addressed, whether successfully or not, but it was certainly dealt with as part of the teachers and schools thinking. Okay.
All right. We'll let you keep going. Keep the questions coming, though, people.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Okay. This is a project that well has led to a few papers now, because the data set was really quite interesting and rich. It came out of the STEM and Teacher Enrichment Academy at the University of Sydney. Gay Williams and I at Deakin were asked to evaluate it some years back by Judy Anderson, who was at the time director. And Gay and Judy, I think, are in the audience here now. So that, some of the questions we might even throw to them. This STEM Teacher Enrichment Academy, it works around a workshop program where schools apply and they send in 6 teachers, 2 technology teachers, 2 science teachers, 2 maths teachers from each school. And they are taken through a set of activities, workshops that both attend to disciplinary knowledge, but also the opportunity for interdisciplinary planning. And they it's conducted over a year, so they go back, plan, implement, come back and report, and there's also mentors go out into schools. So it's quite a well-designed and coherent program. And what we did in this study I'm going to talk about now is to look at two schools that we felt seemed to be good examples in that they, at the Academy workshops, had hit the ground running, so to speak, and were already thinking about quite advanced levels of collaboration between the teachers. And so we went in, and Gay, in fact, interviewed teachers and students from each of those two schools. The Kirk School is a billy cart derby. It's one project that we focused on there, and I'll describe it. And the Mary School had a STEM ed program consisting of multiple project units that integrated science, maths, and technology. Each school, as it turned out, had strong focus on students taking control of their learning. And it should be pointed out that these were integrated STEM programs, but that wasn't a requirement of the Academy. But in fact, most schools moved to integrated programs in some degree over the time. One of the questions we were interested in is what was driving these schools to move towards an integrated STEM program. And so here are some quotes I think that are quite interesting about the kind of depth of thinking that underpinned the move. Mark, who was, I think he was the science coordinator at Mary's School, and a bit of a mover and shaker in the program, talked about a feeling that traditional approaches were becoming less and less effective, and that traditional approaches were increasingly disconnected from how students like to learn. So there was a real problem with engagement. They also felt students were really not motivated to really think deeply. They were kind of doing the subjects like going through the motions. Anna was excited by having kids engaged in maths and making authentic, correct connections. And similarly, or somewhat similarly, at Kirk School, Jane talked about the focus on student engagement, cross-curricular collaboration, critical thinking, and problem solving. And Veena was explicit about, for maths particularly, engaging those kids you lose. So it's about students that really are not really sticking with the STEM subjects, and not, or even if they are, thinking about them in terms of fairly shallow problem solving methods. They're wanting to get them more engaged in deeper level thinking, and making more authentic connections. And as Mark articulates, seeing this as as more in tune with the way students now like to learn. So let's look at what happened. This is a billy cart derby. It involved, at Kirk School, it involved the design and testing of billy carts in a runoff at the end of the project. It was led out of the Technology and Applied Studies TAS, or technology subject, but within the cohort, their design issues and considerations were then taken into the maths and the science classes separately, and they would work on background investigations and considerations, thinking about the design from a maths and from a science point of view. There was careful planning around this from the maths and the science point of view. I'll show you that in a minute. And there was a website set up so that teachers in the three subjects would know what each other would, where they were up to at any particular time. So there was a lot of collaboration, talking together, planning together with those teachers. That quote there from Veena is about technology students coming into the maths class as experts and asking for advice. And so in maths, they would do investigations around axle or wheel diameter and size, and thinking about the geometric aspects of the cart design. That other quote is about the natural kind of natural way of doing writing and maths because of the student interest. This is an example of the science curriculum for New South Wales, where this was set. It's and what teachers really had to take into account when they were designing their tasks. And you'll see here they're mainly dealing with science practices, but it was built around the topic of force and motion in science. And so students did some set piece experiments, but they also had investigative, their own designed investigations to test different aspects of car design. One of them came up with a wind tunnel to test the aerodynamics, and that became quite a thing across the year level. Everyone got a wind tunnel, quite an innovative design. And looking at impact of different shapes of wheels or seat belts and so on. There's some examples, just some examples of some of the students' work, investigative work around friction there, and a set piece work about action-reaction forces. And this is part, I just lifted it from part of a student's experiment about aerodynamic shape and time down a ramp. I'm not quite sure why. Those results look a bit odd, but anyway, there was, I thought, looking at it, quite a sophisticated judgment about the evidence for the aerodynamic shape actually leading to a faster run. There's some examples of the technology and design work, and the maths was often around geometry, trigonometry, area shapes, looking at templates, scaling, things like that. They had community involvement through a car roadshow. These were vintage cars, came onto the school oval, and students looked at the design features from and measured them from a maths point of view, looking at the design features from a science point of view, and finally the race day. So that was Kirk School. So if we look at the teachers' motivations and experience at Kirk School, one of the big things was this notion of greater creativity being demanded and attention to meaningfully engaging students. So Abby is talking about ways of making it more exciting for them to actually like maths. Vina is talking about encouraging other teachers to be a bit more creative in their teaching, about team building and professional development. I think you can see underpinning that this was not always immediately either easy or necessarily valued by maths teachers in this case. They had to be convinced that this was a valuable way of doing it. Also the comment, there were a few comments from both schools made that the students had to be convinced as well, often that the students just go, can you just tell us what work we have to do? It's like, oh my God, I don't want you just to sit down and do work. So getting the students to actually engage and be creative was often against the tradition that they had to deal with. There are a few more quotes from teachers at Mary's School. One was about, one of the themes was around realigning students' agency. So again, this notion of re-educating students and talking to the students explicitly about them becoming more involved in driving their own learning. So there was this, because students really had to make decisions, they had to make collaborative decisions, they had to invest in that. There was strategic coordination of the disciplines and the shift to an inquiry pedagogy. So Boyd is talking about how he's now started as a science teacher to integrate more maths into his science and look for links across. And that would involve doing more experiments that create data that the maths can then be built around. Mark talked about the need to teach staff design thinking. That was a big pillar at Mary, and to shift the thinking of teachers from the notion of themselves as providing content to thinking of themselves as educational or designers of educational experience. So this is your inquiry approach, your student-centered work. And that was pretty much the case right across the STEM Academy schools, that they gradually became more confident with actually having students making decisions and having their learning being central, with themselves being involved there. One of the things that came up in a couple of cases was this notion of just-in-time learning, where at Mary at one point they tried to do the maths that was needed for a project down the track 10 weeks later, and the students just didn't remember, it was irrelevant to them. And so the quote here is about the need to actually do the maths or the science at the time it's needed. And this is one of the things that the students also talked about, the usefulness of knowledge. When you know it's being used pretty much right away. And again, Mark, who's the big picture thinker at Mary, talking about a substantial change in educational culture. So what we're seeing here, I think, with the STEM was only one part of what was happening at Mary to shift the culture of teaching and learning at the school. And so again, I'm making the point that STEM is part of this wider movement in education, I think, and it's being made explicitly there by Mark. And if we look at students' perceptions, 4 points here at Kirk: practical purposes of learning and knowledge, purposeful relating of subjects, coherence of the experience of learning, and attraction of group problem solving. So you'll see I've got in red there. From Rick, it was practical rather than sitting around and doing plain old bookwork. Thea, you're working towards a project and you're able to see in full scale how it's going to work. Your maths and science are related, which was good, emphasized it was good. Thea talking about, Thea is someone who loves technology and applied studies and usually hates going to math, or at least not liking it. But when you're doing STEM, you say, yeah, I'm actually going to work on something I'm invested in. And having the 3 hours, but that's across the 3 subjects, working on the same project. A number of students talked about how they liked that. And the comment there about the group work. From Mary, here's some quotes about choice, creativity, what I'd call epistemic agency, making decisions about evidence and reasoning processes, a sense of significant thinking, relevance and purpose of disciplines, and encouragement of potential STEM futures. So we didn't have names for these. Grade 7 girl. You get to choose, you have more freedom and creativity. You use your brain more, you discover how to do it by yourself. It's more challenging. You don't just learn stuff in a classroom and then not do anything with it. In science, we get to do field tests of what we've learned. It's just very interesting. And this grade 7 girl, they went on a STEM Ed camp and visited the university, and so was inspired to think about engineering as a potential future. So in making sense of all that, just trying to think about what pulled those what were the key elements of those projects, we came across a paper by Jill, which was actually very useful for us and unlocked some of the things that we were thinking about. So this is a framework for integrated STEM, and there are 7 features or dimensions of integrated STEM that was described in that paper. And you can see, if you look, how well it characterizes what was happening at Kirk, and it also worked very well for the Mary School. So the tasks were selected to elicit student engagement, to be meaningful. Both were really driven by engineering design and consisted as a coherent focus. There was, in terms of context integration, schools carefully planned to ensure the maths and the science were pursued at some depth and related to the curriculum, and I showed you some of that for science. Content integration, and this answers that question about whether the students knew they were doing the disciplines. The connections were structured through assignment of relevant topics and tasks for each subject, reinforced by teachers closely collaborating, and also some of the assessment, or the assessment was explicitly tied to each of the disciplines. Engagement in authentic STEM practices. The students followed individual solution paths. They make their own decisions. They were experts in commissioning science and maths problem solving, and encouraged data and evidence-based exploration. So 21st century skills include collaboration, critical and creative responses into design solutions. And STEM careers, there was no explicit discussion of careers, well, not that we found in our interviews, but certainly there was representation of how these maths and science ideas and engineering ideas were used in the real world, if you like, through car design, for instance. And there was quite a lot of features. There were some features about, for instance, safety specification of cars at Kirk, and so on. And so really that framework really held quite true to what we were seeing at those two schools. So to sum up, I've talked about the drive to STEM as part of an economic agenda for education. And so my question really is, can we redirect STEM to socially progressive and critical agendas? You know, does it just need to be about producing fodder for the STEM industries? The need to reimagine science education for rapidly changing futures. What are the implications for Anthropocene challenges? And here we've got all of those issues around work, futures and changes, and the need to develop a broader set of skills and competencies. STEM as a response that offers a reorienting of disciplinary education. And I tried to show that the way that the maths and science appear differently in this context. But the question is, what are the challenges for schools and teachers? And the need to plan interdisciplinary relations at different temporal scales. And there's a question of coherence. You know, I think it is an ongoing question, really. At Mary School, they, for instance, in some of the projects, they ran a straight maths alongside where they felt that they couldn't find ways of fitting particular maths curriculum concepts into the STEM curriculum. And so it was maths running alongside the STEM. In science, it was more, they were more able, they had the more flexibility to be able to make it work. And I'll just leave you with this this challenge, I suppose. This is a chapter I wrote a couple of years ago with Daleen Swanson from the UK, which was really a critical paper about the focus on STEM policy at government level, where we argued that if you look in red, STEM advocacy is part of a global movement that promotes an instrumentalist view of the purposes of schooling, one that serves the interests of national and global capital to the possible detriment of alternative schooling purposes. Okay, so I think we need to be on guard against this and avoid being captured by this kind of focus on producing work-ready students. In terms of the opportunities and challenge, we argued from the case studies there were opportunities to link interdisciplinary STEM to issues of global significance or to ethical and inclusive societal deals. And so there was this opportunity to have STEM serve wider educational purposes. And on the question of STEM disciplines and epistemic integrity, we argued that while interdisciplinary projects are engaging and productive in the medium term, a convincing interdisciplinary STEM curriculum is yet to be conceptualized. That's out there. And finally, we argued there, and this is what I'm arguing here, that a more meaningful conception of interdisciplinary STEM lies in the way it represents authentic invention, coordination, and evaluation of disciplinary ideas in complex settings. So what I'm arguing is that STEM has great potential for having us think more deeply and meaningfully about the STEM subjects individually in wider contexts that will be appropriate for these challenging futures that I talked about at the start. So Jill, I'll leave it there. I'll leave that hanging as a question. Is this, do people still think this is still the case? We can talk about it.
All right. Thank you very much, Russell. Really appreciate it. So everyone, if you want to either unmute, clap, use your reaction button, however you want to acknowledge there. And looks like Russell's got his email there on that last screen. So if we don't get to everyone's questions in the chat, I'm sure he'll be happy to engage you in that way. So the chat kind of blew up in this last segment, Russell. So a lot going on. You got people talking back and forth. I'll try and capture a few of those, and others feel free to, if you want to unmute and jump in as well. We'll see how crazy it gets with this many people. But there was definitely some conversation about STEAM, Russell, and thinking about how we would think about the A in different ways. There's a lot of people advocating for social science and humanities, some SSI approaches. So would you like to comment on like STEM versus STEAM and the value of adding the A or not?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the A can be seen in different sorts of ways. We're certainly doing work ourselves. I mean, I'm a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and I think we're very aware that the Academy of Science has a year of government to a far greater extent, and yet I think some of the scientists I'm working with are very aware of the need to, like, for instance, with energy policy and energy and biodiversity, you really need to think about those social issues. Humanities are really important to think about. The legal implications, for instance, or cultural implications of some of this work. And we've also done some work linking visual arts with science. And I think what it does is expands the language of science and brings in values and personal positioning in ways that we tend to have avoided in science. And so I think you know, there's a lot of advocacy of STEAM, and I think it's been difficult to actually make it a curriculum object, but I think in the individual cases that I'm aware of, including some of our own, it's really important.
There's also some chat about mathematics. A lot of us were lamenting that mathematics teachers have the hardest time shifting towards STEM approaches. I think Desi had said, well, science teachers aren't good at teaching math either. We just grab the calculator and don't do a good job with math. Is there any words of wisdom you can help us with for either working with our math teachers or helping our science teachers do a better job with mathematics?
Yeah, I think, it is I mean, I think it's a real thing that maths, because of the way that the curriculum is structured in maths, much more kind of finely grained progressions than we tend to do in science. And I think, I don't think that's a great thing actually myself, but I think on the other hand, I can appreciate that it is really important for kids to sort of move through an increasingly sophisticated ways of looking at number or geometry or whatever. And so I think STEM does cut across that, so I can understand the difficulty. And I personally wouldn't advocate that you want to teach a full maths course just through STEM. That would be, I think it would be very tricky to be able to do that. But on the other hand, I think maths teachers could benefit. Is this arrogant? Maybe it is, I don't know. But maths teachers, I think, could benefit from really thinking about how to have their students apply their maths in meaningful ways in STEM contexts. And that's what we found with some of these activities. And from my own point of view, we've worked a bit with Richard Lira and Leona Schauble. I don't know if people would be aware of their work, I guess. We have a current project, or just finishing, on interdisciplinary science and maths in primary schools. And we've been designing units where the maths and the science feed off each other. And it really opens up in ways that I hadn't quite expected. I mean, I have a physics background myself. And so the maths was kind of natural to me. But if you take what is a normal, like a science investigation, you can get a lot of data that you can play with mathematically that really enhances the maths in ways that is richer, I think, than is normally encouraged in the maths curriculum. So we had kids, for instance, doing graphing at year one in ways that wouldn't expect until grade 4 or 5, because what we were doing was situated in a science investigation sort of setting, like in one case, looking to chart what living things were in the school ground by sampling various plots, and then kids had to find ways of representing that, and they were inexorably led to graphical means of, and also thinking about variation and thinking about measures of central tendency. And what in science we tend to stop short of really pushing that bit further to think about what maths teachers are interested in, and that is the sort of logic of those data modeling means. So I think you can get a lot of really good maths out of science. And on the other hand, the maths raise questions, if you set it up right, that then lead you to ask further questions of the science. Why is it different like that? Or what is that pattern really telling us? And Rich Lear's work and Leona's work is a lot like that. It really is very rich.
Yeah, that's great. All right, let's see here. Tony just added a question. Tony asked, what role do you envision for the community outside of the school, including STEM professionals and the community subject matter experts, to support the design and enactment of authentic integrated STEM learning in your model?
Yeah, we've actually been doing some research in interviewing and representing scientists through video-based resources that teachers can tap into. I've been for a while engaged in looking at school science community partnerships, and they're really can be really quite powerful for modeling scientific practice. You get practicing scientists, and they could be professionals of various sorts that have scientific expertise, like agronomists or dentists or whatever, coming into the school, either talking to kids or helping the teacher plan units. But the trouble is that it's hard to organize, and there's potentially a lot of kind of communication problems between them. And so we've been trying to find ways of actually representing their work through both short video snippets that talk not only about the science, but what drives them, why are they doing this stuff, and trying to work with their data as well, so that you get some genuine kind of engagement with data work. So I think these things are quite can be quite powerful, but have to be managed. But how you do it at scale becomes an issue.
Yeah, scale's definitely an issue there. So I'm trying to make sure I don't miss anyone's questions. If I do, feel free to jump in. But there was a question around creativity. And Ganeem asked, how did you decide or measure the creative responses during problem solving or designing or creativity of products?
Sorry, how did you
decide or measure the creative responses during the problem solving or the designing or creativity of the product? So like the role of creativity, and how would you assess that in some of these, like the Billy Cart project and those kinds of things?
Yes. Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I don't think the schools actually measured creativity. They talked about it. They talked about the fact, I guess they were looking at the variety of responses and the fact that some, were unexpected, I suppose, innovative. How you get a measure of creativity, that's an interesting issue. The other thing I'd say about that with creativity is that I think creativity is often associated with the arts, or with divergent thinking perhaps, but it has particular forms in the different disciplines. And so creativity in maths and creativity in science are a bit different and would be measured differently. So, and a lot of that has to do with the creative use of the representational forms of the discipline. So like within science, can you come up with really interesting interpretations of evidence, or can you come up with a really intriguing or unexpected way of even measuring something that will get you your answers? So I think I don't think. Sorry, I hadn't really thought about this before, but I guess what the question implies is the creativity in technology, but I think there's also creativity in those students investigating, and there's creativity in the maths work they do as well. And so I think it's possible that it could be measured separately in the disciplines.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge. I've got a student doing her PhD in this space, and it's it when you see it, I guess it's what we've got. But
there's a comment. I just point out there's a comment by Judy Anderson, who, as I say, was director of the STEM Academy, and she's talking about I have some sympathy for maths teachers, but I see the benefits of integrated curriculum learning. My advice: advocate for a change to curriculum and assessment, and free mathematics teachers to be creative and engage students. So yeah, she's arguing it's a curriculum constraint.
Mm-hmm. I definitely saw that from others in the chat too, from the US perspective and other countries as well, that it's difficult structurally for the math teachers. Yeah. Let's see. Shalmet asked, do you think it's important to continue to also teach separate STEM disciplines in addition to the integrated STEM curriculum?
Yeah, I don't know. I think probably. I think Mary School had their STEM Ed program that was covering, a lot of the curriculum, but not all of it. For maths, I'm inclined to think that longer term macro kind of macro level scale is difficult for designing. I don't know. I don't have a practical suggestion, but I guess my expectation would have been that STEM would be part of a curriculum. The other thing to say is I suppose, if you kind of accept the way I'm arguing, that model I showed you earlier on with Banksia's school, where the maths teachers were also science teachers, I mean, that wasn't critical, but it helped. But you can teach STEM within a discipline. If you accept my argument that you know, it's an orientation, and you do use maths in science, you do use design. And so with science, I think within a science course, you can move to a STEM. But it's richer, of course, if you have that collaboration across disciplines for at least some of the time. But I wouldn't like to pronounce on that.
Yeah, it seems to work better in one way or the other, and depending on the context. Right? It's always interesting. Yeah. Oh, let's see. There's some questions about transdisciplinarity. Doug asked, can you comment on transdisciplinary? Is the whole greater than the sum of its parts? And Tasneem followed up with that and said, and how could we authentically measure the outcomes of transdisciplinary STEM?
Yeah, this is the problem I was referring to in that earlier section of my talk, that if you've got those sort of circles interacting, you know, what is at the center? What you know, is there something there that is greater than the bits? And that was why I drew that triangle, if you remember, with from the wheelchair ramp. I'm thinking that you shouldn't think of it as a mixing that well, maybe it is, I don't know. I mean, maybe it is, there's something there about integrating them that you can consider as a kind of phoenix arising from the ashes of the disciplines or something like that. But if you look at the actual context in which the STEM project is being carried out, it's the fact that the design and the science, design tech and the science, we're in a social context. And so you start to realize there's a sort of a meta knowledge, if you like, or meta competence about how you link science with technology. And we've certainly found in our maths and science interdisciplinary project, it's not that there's what would you say, a Mayans or a SATs thing happening by combining the two, but it's that you learn that the maths is really powerfully applied to scientific situations, and that the science can, you know, draw out, or you can invent maths to think about how to solve a science problem. So I think the meta-knowledge is in the individual, I'm arguing, individual relations between the disciplines. Because I think really the disciplines aren't there for an arbitrary reason. They've grown up. I know, you know, people can argue they've siloed themselves and they kind of become unreal or whatever. But in reality, people you know, do become mathematicians, or people do become scientists associated with particular forms of problem solving, particular languages, particular epistemic practices. And I don't think you kind of combine those. It's more that you kind of apply them across. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah. All right. Do we have, I tried to do a good job of checking the chat. If I didn't catch your question, I apologize. You can, if there's more questions, you can pop them in, or you can always be brave and unmute. I don't have to MC the whole thing here. So if there's other questions or things that I didn't catch in the chat.
I noticed Gay Williams, who was also part of that project, has got it in the chat. She's so Mark from Mary noted an increased enrolment in senior secondary STEM subjects for the next year. So there is some suggestion change could be happening. Rather than interests of only advanced students, Year 7 Mary girls who had been interested in humanities, because there was an opportunity to be creative, now recognise STEM subjects could provide opportunities for creativity as well. So Gay's arguing that there was evidence that right across the scale at Mary School, there was evidence of greater engagement with maths. So that would speak to, I think, the longer term coherence in a way of STEM, that you're attracting students at all those levels.
especially around mathematics, because that's the one that oh, I like science, but I don't like math. We hear that so often. So,
Yep.
Just so come up in the chat, can you elaborate a little bit about redirecting STEM for social change and critical agenda?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think like if you're going to direct science or maths to those critical agendas, I think then you've got to be in a STEM situation. I suppose science alone, but science always involves maths, and critical agendas, I think, always imply action and solutions that are socially meaningful. And so I think you're in STEM territory immediately you start talking about that. And so I think that, for instance, we've become quite interested in Australia in Indigenous knowledges and their place in the science curriculum, or in the curriculum in general, and particularly for sustainability. So there are real social justice issues there. And so if you're really talking about, let's say, I don't know, biodiversity, you can do it just as a set of rules, okay, trophic levels, problems with removing, particular levels, and environmental issues, sustainability issues. But if you're really wanting to be critical, you've got to look at the human-environment relations, which is one of the big points in that agency in the Anthropocene document I was talking about that will be put out by OECD in relation to PISA. And so, sorry, I'm thinking my way through this question. I think STEM has particularly important meaning in its attention to authentic situations, drawing on, and if you're talking critical, drawing on multiple disciplines. And that's where I suppose that question about STEAM comes in, that you really can't think about these big picture issues and get kids to think about what positions they will take, what actions they will take, what decisions they will make around questions of energy usage, climate, biodiversity, whatever, or social justice, without bringing in the science, the technology, and the humanities. So I guess I'm trying to sort of think about that question at the level of principle, and I say, yeah. And that's actually, when I think about it, was one of Rich Lear's criticism of some of the STEM activities where it's about building bridges, and you work out that you need your trusses to go that way, and his question was, well, what next? But I think that in a more significant sense, STEM could be seen as dealing with bigger term problems about how do we design for preserving a wetland, for instance, or what kind of home energy kind of policy and practice might we set up to have a lighter footprint.
Yeah, those are pressing problems for our kids and their futures, for sure. So. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Has anyone got any last burning questions? Can unmute, drop something in the chat. Oh, the chat just someone. Yeah, we've got lots of thank yous and appreciations coming in the chat, just to highlight that. Other questions?
All right, that's great. I see a few friends there too. So
yeah, it's been nice. I could see a few of my current students. I've seen a few former students come in, so it's nice to see familiar faces and to see new faces as well. So thank you for everyone for being here. For some of you, it was I saw someone from South Africa had put in, it's like basically was midnight when we started. So whether it's first thing in the morning for our Australian friends, or middle of the afternoon for me, or late at night for Europeans and our African colleagues. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Russell, so much for keeping us engaged. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. Hope to see some of you in Chicago for the NARST conference. But for those of you who can't, well, there'll be more webinars and more chances to interact. So, all right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jill.
I'll leave it
everybody.
open. If there's any last questions, I'll stop recording. But there we go. Let's turn that off.
And if people are going to be serious.